what to expect with COVID-19 client contracts in the year 2021. It's going to be a lot of first verse, same as the second verse, but let's get into it today on the podcast.
This is the Wedding Industry Law Podcast, a podcast dedicated to wedding professionals that are just trying to keep it legal. And now, your host, Rob Shank.
Hello out there, welcome back. If everything goes according to plan, this episode should debut on Monday, December 14th. So, happy holidays to you all. We are in the middle of holiday season, and of course, more importantly, we are only 2 weeks away from this turd sandwich of a year that is 2020 being over with. And with that in mind, I wanted to take this episode, to talk about some things that we need to understand and know about client contracts, COVID-19, and reducing our risk of lawsuits or losing money because of COVID-19 heading into Q1, Q2, and maybe Q3 and Q4. Let's just say all of 2021, because let's face it, COVID-19 is not going anywhere anytime soon. So we need to make sure that we are still addressing this. We are not hiding our heads in the sand and waiting for prom like Molly Ringwald. Okay, that's deep cut reference. Don't worry about that. All right, anyway, a couple of housekeeping matters before we get into the substance of this episode. That is to say, I will be off the next 2 weeks. So the Monday, December 21st and Monday, December 28th, there will not be an episode of this program. I will hopefully, if everything goes according to plan, I will be heading out to Funky Town. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to spend the holidays with my wife's family for a very hand sanitized, socially distant, mask required holiday get together season. So I will see you on the other side. That is to say 2021, January 4th of 2021 to be exact. So for the next 2 weeks, that is the December 21st and December 21st and December 28th, there will be no episode. Coming back January 4th of 2021 with all new content, all new episodes of the podcast. I know that 2 or 3 weeks ago, I had my own pity party and I was whining about how sometimes I feel like I'm just talking into the void, talking to myself. And many of you answered the call and you pointed out to me very lovingly that no, it's not just one person listening. There could be possibly tens of people listening. And I appreciate that. It actually brought a tear to my eye that I had such a overwhelming response from the 2 or 3 people. So I appreciate that. We are growing not exponentially. We are growing very linearly, very slowly, but we are. And I appreciate every single person that has reached out to me with comments, enthusiasm, pats on the back. I really do appreciate that. I read every single one of them and I respond to every single one of them. At least I think I do, except for the ones that are clearly robots. And like, sexygirl.com is, I swear, the minute that any of these podcasts are published, I get a comment on my YouTube channel, sexygirls.com or whatever it is. So I have to always report that. So setting them aside, our numbers are in the tens now in terms of audience. So I appreciate that. Anyway, housekeeping done. See you in 2021. Now, what about COVID-19 for 2021? There's maybe 3 or 4 items that I want you to remember always, aside from the fact that COVID-19 is not going away anytime soon. The first thing is this. You must deal with COVID-19 in your contract somewhere, whether you have a COVID-19 clause, like, literally like COVID-19, this is what's going on, or if you have integrated COVID-19 into your force majeure clause, which is perfectly allowable. However, do not rely on a force majeure clause alone. If your force majeure clause is still stuck in the 90s or stuck in the 2000s, it needs to be updated to reflect pandemic situation adequately. Okay. So one way or the other, through your force majeure clause or through some type of COVID-19 clause, you need to deal with what happens if COVID-19 has caused the government of the location of where the event is going to be to do XYZ and change the how the event is going to go forward. Your contract must deal with that. what happens with the money, what happens with regard to the obligations to reschedule, all of that. Now, I will say this, if you want more information about that specific topic, then please go back and listen to episode 25, where I talk about tips for a rock solid force majeure clause. Okay. Episode 25, 4 tips for a rock solid force majeure clause. So if you listen to that episode, implement that specifically for COVID-19, in many instances, you will be okay. Again, you're going to want to talk to a local attorney, but by and large, COVID-19 must still be addressed specifically by name, explicitly. What happens to the money? What happens if the event changes because of a local ordinance or a state ordinance or a state law, whatever the case may be, affecting that event must be done. Okay. No question. That's number one. So if you don't have that, that's where you start. And I would start by going and listening to episode 25. And then if you want to get to the basic understanding of COVID-19 laws, you can go back to episodes, I think 1 through 5 of this podcast. They all dealt with coronavirus. Anyway, now, number 2, this is becoming more and more of a situation because we've gone from the concept of long ago, we've gone from the concept of complete shutdown and illegality of events to now we're going to have events, but they are going to occur in such and such a fashion. In other words, you must have a certain number of people in a building, or they must be this far apart, or, maybe this restaurant can have something and this venue can't, these type of things. So I guess what I'm trying to say is your contract, to the best that it can, must identify what the objective standards of the event are. Is it still going to go forward if people must wear masks, but you're not limited to people? So if you can have as many people as you want, but they have to have masks, is that okay? Is it okay that people must be socially distanced and therefore you can't have couples dancing unless they're a member of one household? In other words, you need to go through the spectrum of possibilities and define when the event is really no longer an event. And the reason why that's important is because you might be ready, willing, and able to cater an event or to take pictures of an event, but your client is going, well, this is not really much of a wedding if everybody's got to wear masks. So understanding when the event is no longer an event as anticipated. Okay. That is, aside from dealing with COVID-19 in general, is number one. Number 2 is certainly right under that in terms of critical. When is an event not an event? This needs to be taken care of in your contract. So when the parties set out to have that wedding, you need to anticipate if there are changes to the law or changes to what we are allowed to do in our city or our county or whatever it is. Does it still go on? Okay. In other words, even though we can physically still be there, is it still worth having? Okay. And if that's the case where you don't, then you go back to whatever your COVID clause is or your force majeure clause is, and you deal with the obligations of rescheduling, what happens to the money, all that kind of stuff. So really getting into the meat and potatoes of whether there's an event or not. Okay. Well, if my grandmother can't go, that's not an event. If grandma can come, but she's got to wear a mask, that's not an event. If grandma can come, but she can only sit at a table with other members of her household, that's not an event. That's what I'm talking about. Getting into the heart of what makes a wedding, making sure that the parties on both sides are understanding when COVID-19 and or local laws are preventing that wedding as contemplated from going forward. The third thing is this. Your contract should now, in as best it can, develop expectations of the client's behavior as it pertains to infection control. So do you want the client to follow CDC guidelines? Do you want to make sure the client is responsible for the guests following CDC behavior? So in other words, if you're at if your local jurisdiction allows the event to take place, but everybody's got to wear a mask, and your client's saying, I'm not wearing a mask and we're going forward with it, you need to address that in the contract of what happens then. Are you going to be allowed to leave because they're not following the law and they're essentially going to make you break the law? Making sure that you set the expectations of what the client should do. And that can be sometimes as simple as you're going to follow whatever the law says in our jurisdiction. And if you don't, then this is the ramifications. I leave, or whatever the case is. So that needs to be addressed, because I see that a lot of times where unfortunately, a lot of times this depends on where you are on the political spectrum. But the concept of, I don't believe that this is real and I'm going to do what I want. And then you have a vendor that's like, this is very real and I want to obey the law. And there's conflict there, which, as best you can, we want to try to bear that out in the contract and resolve those issues in the contract. So what are the expectations of the client with regard to infection control at the event? And then what are the ramifications if the client breaches those obligations? What happens if the client is not agreeing to wear a mask? What happens if the client is not agreeing to monitor the guests wearing masks? What is the ramifications? Can you leave? Is that a breach of contract? These type of things. To the best that you can, you want to have these conversations at the beginning and boil them down in your contract whenever possible. Essentially just client is agreeing to XYZ. If not, XYZ. ABC. 1, 2, 3s. Okay. All right. The next one is you're going to want in 2021 to continue to develop your own policies and procedures with regard to infection control. And what I mean by that is how you are dealing with COVID-19 and preventing COVID-19 with your own employees or your own contractors. So having a written policies and procedures that you follow with regard to mask use, with regard to hand sanitizing, how often you're going to wash your hands. What is the policy for if if somebody has been around somebody that's been exposed? What happens at your office? Like, does everybody work from home then for a week or two? Do you mandate testing if that happens? Do you want to develop policies and procedures for your own company? And now this has implications with regard to workers' comp. It has implications with regard to your liability if your employees get sick. And if you want to know more about that, I would recommend going back and listening to episode 22, where we talk about avoiding COVID-19 lawsuits, as well as episode 12, which is liability in your business and your employees. And we had Sarah Tucker, I believe, is a defense attorney who represents companies being sued essentially for employees getting COVID-19. But episode 12 and episode 22, those are COVID-19 episodes dealing more in depth with this concept of policies and procedures with your own company. So go check those episodes out. But having that with regard to your own people is going to help you reduce the likelihood of being sued by your own people. Okay. It also helps keep you safer. It helps keep you healthy, right? Okay. So the last thing is, I would recommend having the policies and procedures that you're going to implement with regard to infection control that is applicable to the event, and give that to the client prior to the event. So why do we do that? Well, we do that because the client, theoretically, if one of your people gives the client COVID or, causes the event to be a super spreader event, there's a possibility that you could be liable for it, or your company could be liable for it. So one of the ways that we reduce the likelihood of being liable for this type of negligent conduct is to have a policy and abide by the policy, okay? And then make the client aware of what the policy is. So that way the client, if you do all of what you're supposed to do under that policy, the client can't say, well, you should have done this, this, and this. Well, no, you knew going into this is the extent of what we were going to do ourselves as a company for the prevention of infections and COVID-19 at the event. So having the policies and procedures, how you interact with the client, how you interact with your own people at the event, making sure the client understands that up front, even before the contract is signed, give them a copy of it, make sure that they acknowledge that they have a copy of it. That's going to go a long way to reducing the likelihood that the client or maybe even guests can sue you and be successful if you, in fact, or one of your people, in fact, gives them COVID-19 or not. So in other words, let me sum up. First thing is this: 2021, going into 2021, COVID-19 is not going anywhere. So it must be addressed in terms of money, in terms of postponement, in terms of cancellations, explicitly in your contract. Number two, you must make sure that you have an understanding in writing in that contract of what constitutes COVID-19 disrupting that event. Not necessarily, it's not from the standpoint of, okay, well, the law says you can't have that event at all. Everything shelter in place. That's easy. I'm talking about the gray areas, okay? If you can have the event, but everybody's got to wear masks, is that grounds to have to reschedule? Make sure that that is specified in your contract. Try to be as specific as possible without it being a 30-page document. Third, develop the obligations of the client with regard to infection control and make the client aware of the ramifications of their violation of those obligations for infection control. That's number three. Number four, develop your own company's policies and procedures. This is going to help you prevent lawsuits against you by your people. And then finally, number five, develop your own policies and procedures with regard to the actual event day. Give those to the client. Again, reduces your likelihood of successful lawsuits against you for COVID spreading at the event by the client or the event guest. So not a lot has changed in terms of how the law is approaching COVID-19, at least in my opinion, in terms of liability for lawsuits or breach of contract. But again, if you're not doing these things, do them, okay? Because who knows? Not a lot of loss. There's not a high likelihood that you're going to be sued for giving somebody COVID-19. But if you are one of the unlucky percentages, like you draw the short straw, having this stuff reduces the likelihood of success of one of those lawsuits. So make sure you have one of these, you have all these things covered in your contract to the best that you can. Make sure that you have these policies and procedures, and you should be okay in the 2021, as they say on the streets. Now, again, I am super hoping that you're enjoying the content of these episodes. And if you are, like and subscribe, check out the YouTube channel. In fact, check out the YouTube channel first. I'm not even sure why I'm calling this a podcast anymore, because really it's not a podcast. It's a video, it's a show. So I think that might be something that I address in 2021, not necessarily COVID, but this is an extra thing besides COVID that I'm going to address, but I might have to revamp the concept of this. This is a show that happens to be a podcast. So that's something I'll have to think about for 2021 as I'm in Funky Town. Anyway, what's today? Yes. Okay. So it's been a pleasure presenting this show to you in the 2020. And I guess with that, we'll see you in the 2021, folks. Happy New Year.
Thank you for listening to the Wedding Industry Law Podcast. This podcast is intended for general information only. Nothing in this podcast is intended to be legal advice. Do not rely on this podcast for your legal matter. Instead, consult an attorney in your area. Thanks, obrigada, até semana que vem.